Well, good morning to you all. Thank you all for taking time from your busy schedules for joining us for the Pacific Council's webcast on the future of aid and the conflict in Syria. My name is Kemal Kirişçi, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And I will be moderating this conversation here. Today, we're delighted that we're welcoming our speakers, Mona Yacoubian. Mona is the senior advisor to the Vice President for Middle East and North Africa at the United Nations Institute for Peace. Mona has a lot of experience with the Middle East, and most recently she was the executive director of the congressional mandated Syria study group. For those of you who are interested, I would recommend you the report that came out from the study group. And Mona has also a background in the State Department and USA. We are also delighted to have Zaki Menci, who is the Senior Consulting Fellow for the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. I've always liked to say the full name, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He's also the co-founder of the Syrian Center for Policy Research. They do primarily research on the socioeconomic outcome impact that the Syrian conflict has had on the Syrian people. I would recommend their reports as well. Mona has her first degree from Duke and a master's from Harvard University. Zeki is from Damascus University with a master's at Exeter University in international economics. When I saw that, it made me think how way back in the early 80s, I had attended what was known as the Quantitative Methods Summer School at Exeter University. And that's where I first became exposed to personal computers. And here we are now employing Zoom, although I'm feeling a little bit nervous about this technology here. I'd like to make a very brief remark. Unfortunately, here we are almost into a whole decade since the conflict, hostility, protests, and then hostilities in Syria started and evolved into a civil war in parallel to a set of proxy wars that civilians have been paying a very high price. The population of Syria was estimated to be around 22 million in 2017, and more than half of its people have been displaced either internally or externally, have become refugees. But the sad story doesn't stop there. There's been also massive physical destruction to buildings, to cities, to towns, but also destruction of Syria's institutions. On top of it, in the course of this year has also come the COVID-19 pandemic, impacting an already vulnerable, precarious communities in Syria, as well as in the surrounding countries where refugees are hosted. As if this wasn't enough, last week there was this, I don't know how to express it, but this unfair, terrible explosion in Beirut. I would like to think that Lebanese people and people of Beirut will again show another round of resilience. However, that is easier said than done. And I'd like to get the panel discussion started. But before I do so, please be reminded that there will be a questions and answer part of this panel, and that you will be able to forward your questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Mona, before we actually take a nosedive into what's happening in Syria, I wanted to ask you, how is this explosion in Beirut, this terrible development coming at worst times, going to impact the Beirutis, the Lebanese, but also particularly the refugees, as Lebanon today is the country that hosts the largest number of refugees per capita in the world. Mona, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kamal, and thanks to the Pacific Council for this invitation. Yes, I think it's important we talk at least briefly about the double explosion that took place last week in Beirut, precisely because of just how significant the toll was. They're estimating that more than half the city has been damaged by it, more than 5,000 injured, nearly 200 killed, and that includes 40 Syrian workers at least. That's where the toll is now. And this is, of course, coming on top of multiple crises that Lebanon is contending with. And I know today's discussion is really largely about Syria, but I think it's important to note there's real impact on what happened in Beirut with respect to the conflict in Syria. Not only, of course, that Syrians were killed, but also the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon is very, very difficult. Lebanon hosts the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. Syrian refugees have had a very difficult time there. And as Lebanon has gone through a financial crisis, it's Syrian refugees as well as poor and vulnerable Lebanese who are bearing the brunt of that. And then we also see, of course, that with the port now disabled in Lebanon, that is really a primary channel for humanitarian assistance into Syria. So there are multiple effects. And we're going to have to, I think this is a story that's going to continue to unfold.
Thanks, Mona. Maybe from Lebanon we could move into Syria. The explosion in Beirut had been preceded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot has been said how refugees are probably amongst the most vulnerable when it comes to exposure to COVID-19. And in Syria, of course, I've just mentioned the extent to which physical damage has been inflicted, but Syria's health system is also strained. And I know you've been doing considerable work looking into the impact that COVID-19 has taken place, and you had an opportunity to converse with a number of doctors from the field in Syria. Could you please share with us what's unfolding in Syria?
Yeah, absolutely. So the pandemic actually has arrived a bit late in Syria. It of course hit Europe, Iran, and now most recently though, we are seeing a real surge in COVID cases in Syria, particularly in areas that are under government control, in and around Damascus. The WHO numbers are quite low still, maybe 1,300 confirmed cases. But we also know that the government has been suppressing information, and there's other ways to determine that, in fact, the pandemic has really made has had quite an impact already in Syria. There are Facebook pages, for example, featuring death notices. There's talk of hospitals being overcrowded and people even dying in their homes. Most recently, we saw the Jordanians actually just recently noted that they were going to close the border with Syria, at least for a week. And this is because of the COVID surge in the country, inside Syria. Kamal, yes, you rightly note that we had an event last week at USIP, where I work, that featured 4 Syrian doctors, 2 of them actually inside Syria, and one in Turkey and one in the US. For those in the audience that are interested, I commend you the entire event. But it was a very enlightening event to understand the magnitude of the challenges that doctors and others face as they contend with the pandemic in the midst of perhaps one of the most dangerous and complex conflict zones in the world. You noted, Kamal, and I would underscore just how vulnerable the Syrian population is. Syria has one of the highest percentages of internally displaced people, or IDPs. These are people who are living outside of their homes. They're often in very crowded camp-like settings that often don't have access to clean water. And so what we're seeing is that the typical kinds of strategies that one undertakes to deal with a pandemic, whether it's social distancing, quarantining, hand washing, even mask wearing, all of these things are difficult because of the conditions people are living in, as well as the fact that many of them are impoverished. One of the doctors was telling us that people don't have enough money to buy face masks, for example. They're difficult to get. People cannot stay home and not work because of the difficult economic conditions. Most concerning, we have seen now the first reported cases of COVID in the El Hol displacement camp. This is a displacement camp in northeast Syria that has up to 65,000 residents, women and children primarily. These are the people who essentially escaped from the last holdout of ISIS in the little area in southeastern Syria called Bahus. And they ended up in this displacement camp. Unfortunately, the virus has now made its way into the camp. This is potentially a catastrophe in the making. And then, of course, you've noted quite a bit about the impact of now nearly 10 years of conflict in Syria. And what we've seen is, for example, the healthcare infrastructure badly damaged, if not destroyed in some areas. 70% of Syria's doctors have left the country. Mm-hmm. And so it's very difficult to imagine dealing with a pandemic in the midst of a conflict where so many of the very important resources that are needed to address the pandemic have been so badly degraded. The one last thing I want to say, though, about this is there always is a hopeful note we have to look for. And in this case, one of the more interesting things that we learned in our event last week is the ways in which Syrian doctors living abroad are actually mobilizing technology to help train doctors inside Syria. So, for example, using video to train doctors on how to use ventilators, helping to give sort of updated tech practices and techniques to be used in ICU settings. And so, and they're actually finding that they're having far greater reach by using virtual means into Syria than they would on the ground. So they're able to actually reach into areas controlled by the government that they may not have been able to reach before. They're also able to reach other countries in conflict also contending with COVID. So Yemen, for example, they've been able to conduct some trainings. So a very difficult situation in Syria with COVID, but at least one where we're seeing innovation, we're seeing, as always, the resilience of those on the ground as they seek to address the challenge the best that they can.
Thanks, Mona. I'm glad that in the midst of these horror stories, there's still a light, a tiny light of hope. Zaki, I was going to ask you if you could expand a bit more on what Mona has covered. How are ordinary people coping with these day-to-day challenges? And the more fearful part of all this is that I read and hear of a war economy emerging, people benefiting from these conflicts. And then on top of it, there's sanctions that have been imposed. If you could share with us a bit more detail and analysis before we move on to the second round of questions there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. And I would like to thank Pacific Council for giving me the opportunity to participate in this interesting discussion. Actually, after about 10 years of conflict, Syria's economic loss is estimated at more than $500 billion, which is equal to about 9 times Syria's GDP in 2010. This is a huge amount of money for a small country like Syria. This cost actually affect dramatically the living conditions of the majority of Syrian people. And indicators reflect this deterioration. For example, the Living Conditions Index that reflects the accessibility and availability of basic goods and services in Syria dropped by 40% during the conflict. Of course, the drop differs across the governorate, where we can see, for example, in Idlib, which witnessed an intensified armed operations. In Idlib, this index had dropped by 80%. This reflects the catastrophic situation that the Syrian or the ordinary Syrian are living in. Of course, the conflict has also affected negatively the labor market, not only in terms of the increase of unemployment rate, which is now estimated at about 50%, but also in terms of the types and structure of the available jobs in Syria. Different surveys show that 50% of Syrian workers are involved directly or indirectly in conflict-related activities. These activities include smuggling, kidnapping, human trafficking, and of course, include being a member in armed groups. So there is a kind of shift that Syria is witnessing from a traditional economy or traditional productive economy to a destructive economy. This economy is dominated by, mainly now, is dominated by profiteers, warlords, and cronies. This also affects the internal power dynamics in Syria, where these cronies and warlords are dominating the resources of the country and are reallocating these resources for their own benefit, of course, at the expenses of the majority of Syrian people. The poverty surged in Syria, of course, during the conflict. The poverty rate was estimated till the end of 2019 at 85% in Syria. 85% of Syrian population are living under upper poverty line. And it's expected that this rate is highly increased, it's further increased during the last 6 months. This is due to the sharp deterioration and devaluation of the Syrian pound during this last 10 months. Actually, this affects the CPI, Consumer Price Index, that increased during the conflict 27 times compared to the year 2010, and increased 40% of this increase happened during the last 10 months. So the poverty rate was 85%. It's expected to be higher than this now because of the Syrian pound devaluation. And it's not only about the poverty rate, but it's also about the intensity of poverty, the poverty gap, where people are becoming more and more below the poverty line, which makes it very difficult for for any entities or institutions in the future to help Syrian people. Of course, this destruction in the economy makes Syria as a country and Syrian households depend more and more on international aid and remittances. In 2019, the international aid through UN agencies, based on OCHA statistics, showed that Syria received about 2.5 billion US dollars. This is in addition to the remittances sent by Syrians to their families inside Syria, Syrians outside Syria to their families inside Syria, which was estimated last year at 1.7 billion. So we are talking about 4.2 billion US dollars, which formed 25% of Syria's GDP, Syria's current GDP. And this reflects the high dependency of Syrian households on aid and remittances. Of course, the Syria during the conflict, from an economic perspective, Syria lost its economic sovereignty. The Syrian government mainly depends largely on the support of Russia and Iran. And of course, this has implication on the sovereignty, and this increases largely the influence of these two countries inside Syria, not only economic influence, but of course also political influence. And even you can see the influence of Russia and Iran at the local level. So in brief, Syria lost its sovereignty, economic sovereignty and political sovereignty. And the dynamics, or the current dynamics of Syrian economy, is completely dominated now by cronies and warlords.
Thanks, Zaki. And here maybe I should remind us all that Syria, just before this conflict erupted, was a modestly prosperous country with a decent health and education system, even if it had problems of inequality, etc. It was considered by the UN as a middle income country. So that collapse in the last 10 years is a very significant one. Mona, Zeki pointed out how the country, both the parts of Syria controlled by the regime, but also the ones who are beyond it, have become so very much dependent on international assistance. And the UN had put into place since 2014 a system that was legitimizing what they called cross-border assistance coming from neighboring countries. But in I believe December or January, with a Russian veto, these cross points were reduced to just 2. And just a few weeks ago, there was a bitter diplomatic effort in New York, which has reduced these cross borders to 1. And though, to my pleasant surprise, Russia did not veto it the way it said it was going to do it. Could you share with us what's going on there and what this aid on the ground coming from the UN actually mean for the people of Syria?
Sure, thank you. And I think Zaki's points and yours as well are really important when we think about the role of assistance in Syria and just how impoverished, as you know, Kemal, this once solidly middle income country has become. So one can't really overestimate how important the humanitarian assistance is. And you've laid out exactly correctly how this system of UN approved border crossings, which was devised in 2014 because there were parts of the country that were no longer under Syrian government control, and the entire country was in the throes of a very deadly conflict. I would slightly shift a little bit the way you've characterized, though, what happened most recently. The Russians have been raising red flags about this UN cross-border assistance architecture for some time. And they've already been causing some trouble even as far back as 2017. They make the argument that this UN assistance architecture is somehow a threat to the Syrian government's sovereignty. And so those complaints by the Russians have become louder and louder, such that beginning in January of this year, we saw the original 4, as you noted, the 4 crossings cut in half to 2, and then cut in half again to 1 just last month. The Russians actually vetoed 2 resolutions where other members of the Security Council were attempting to keep at least the 2 crossings from Turkey open. And the Russians really have refused that. And so they actually vetoed twice before abstaining on the final, most recent vote. So now we have just 1 crossing from Turkey into Syria. And that is, the period for that crossing is 1 year. And then they will need to renew it. Now, this could not come at a worse time. We've just noted how COVID is now surging in Syria. And while there's been a relative calm in Idlib, a ceasefire that took place in early March has largely been holding, there are lots of concerns that hostilities could begin again. So you have a real restriction in assistance and in access for humanitarian aid at precisely the time when the COVID pandemic is surging and when there are concerns about renewed hostilities. As a result of the closure of one of these, the one border crossing, there are now over 1 million people, I think it's 1.3 million people, living in some 600 different communities who no longer have access to assistance. And the process itself of getting assistance into the northwestern part of Syria has now become more treacherous, more expensive, more complicated, more time consuming. So it really couldn't happen at a worse time. Unfortunately, I think this is a trend that we will continue to see. Many people are skeptical that this one remaining border crossing will be renewed in a year's time when it comes up again for a vote. And that's going to raise much bigger questions about all of the assistance being channeled through Damascus, which has a history of holding back aid from communities that it views as having not been loyal to the regime, and of rewarding those whom it believes have been the regime's supporters. So unfortunately, I think this is setting us up for a very difficult situation going forward.
Thanks, Mona. Zeki, against this background, I hear tiny bit of good news how Syrian civil society, especially in the areas beyond the control of the regime, are organizing themselves. There was this point made about how doctors outside Syria are helping Syrian doctors inside Syria, making use of innovative technologies. I know this might be a bit unrealistic, but can we begin to hope that at a time when all these institutions physically and in the institutional sense of the word collapsing, something positive emerging from civil society? And maybe lastly, before we move on to Q&A, and I'd like to invite the audience maybe to start to prepare their questions. How do we see this conflict evolving? Is there some light at the end of the tunnel? Thanks, Zeki.
Thank you, Kamal. Yeah, actually, I just first want to mention one point regarding the international support and international aid. I want to mention the role of international organizations in Damascus, or the negative role played by international organizations in Damascus in supporting or in being biased against or for the benefit of the regime. For example, during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, WHO insist to pass all the support to northwest and northeast region through Damascus or through the Syrian government, as the Syrian government is the legitimate entity or institution, if we can say, in Syria. And this actually led to a politicization of the aid provided to confront the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is a negative role played by these international organizations as well. It's not only about Russia and international or external actors. Now, in terms of your questions regarding the civil society or the role of civil society, of course, I believe that the role of civil society started, since the beginning of the conflict in Syria. And we can distinguish there are two types of civil society currently, mainly in the regime-controlled area. The first one is civil society organizations that are licensed by the government and working under direct supervision of security agencies and sometimes managed by key figures from the regime. And there are another type of civil society. We have civil society initiatives that are very active, but they are working under difficult conditions. There is a security risk for them working in such an environment. And we believe that these initiatives are the real civil society. This is not to say that people working in the first type of civil society are not doing well. They want to do something for their country. And unfortunately, there is no alternative for them except this type of organizations. Now, talking about civil society, I believe it's the only internal actor that can change the internal power dynamics and dismantle the foundation of the authoritarian regime in Syria. That's why international community should support these types of initiatives. The civil society in Syria actually, or the main challenge, if we can say, is the lack of alternative. The regime put people in two choices, to face only two choices. It's either the regime or chaos and armed conflict. So people prefer the stability, so that's why they accept the regime, or some of them accept the regime, not because they believe in the regime, but because they don't have options and alternatives. And here, where the international community should play more role in supporting these initiatives to come up with more options and more choices for Syrian people to choose or for their future. It's not going to be an easy task. It's not going to change the internal power dynamics in 1 month. It's a long process, but we should start now by supporting civil society initiatives and by providing it's not only about financial support, providing technical support, providing logistical support, providing a protected space for free dialogue between Syrian civil society initiatives, because the environment is very difficult. The authoritarian regime makes it very difficult for these initiatives to act inside Syria. And they face, these initiatives are facing tremendous challenges, including the domination of security agencies, the domination of cronies, warlords, and the institutionalization of corruption. So there are many challenges for these initiatives. That's why it's important to support this actor to change the future of Syria.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think we're very much on time. We would also like to engage the audience in this discussion, and I look forward to receiving questions from you. And yes, I see one on its way. It comes from Ilyasa Patrick Dijkman. How, if at all, has the US involvement in Syria shifted in recent months? Is the tension between Russian and American troops likely to cause the US to be more actively involved in humanitarian assistance? Actually, how about us starting with Zeki, and then Mona, you may wish to follow him.
Yes.
Zeki, the floor is yours. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the problem with the external actors, and mainly the problem with the US in Syria, if we can say involvement in Syria, there is no clear strategy for US in Syria. For instance, sometimes they say that we are here to protect Syrian people. Then they say that we are here to protect the oil fields for our allies in Syria. Here they are talking about Kurdish authorities. I don't believe that the US is trying to have a long-term involvement in Syria, and they prefer not to increase tension with the Russians, and they prefer to use other tool other than the military tool to increase their bargaining power. For instance, we have now the Caesar Act that is actually targeting not, this act is not targeting Syrian actors. It targets foreign entities that have any relation with Syrian regime. So it means that this is a direct message for Syrian regime's allies not to do anything, I mean, not to have any initiatives or any economic projects inside Syria without the acceptance of the United States. And of course, this is the act, I mean, Caesar Act is also an indirect message to USA partners also, not to have any partnership with the regime in the future without the acceptance of United States. So it's a kind of increasing, I mean, the act increases the bargaining power of United States in terms of the future of Syria. So, yeah.
Thanks, Zeki. As I listened to you, I couldn't help but think, where does that leave the WHO, considering the criticism you made about their activities and yes, but I forgot to turn to Mona. Mona, is there something you would like to add before I turn back to Zeki?
Yeah, I would actually. I mean, I think I would very much agree with Zeki's characterization of US strategy on Syria and the lack of coherence. But I would also underscore, I think there was a real watershed moment last October when the United States military pulled back from Syria's northern border with Turkey. And that really dramatically shifted the situation on the ground in northeast Syria. It allowed for Turkey to make a further incursion into northeastern Syria. It paved the way for Russia, and with it the Assad regime, to make inroads into northeast Syria in ways that they hadn't before. And we're also seeing actually growing, quite frankly, cooperation between Russia and Turkey. And so I think in many ways, the US has found itself more isolated on the ground in the Northeast. It has shifted time and again its stated purpose for being there, although the reason it is there, and this we hosted General McKenzie, the commander of CENTCOM, yesterday at USIP. He underscored the reason the US is in Northeast Syria still is because of the campaign to defeat ISIS. That's what brought the US initially there. I would differ a bit with the characterization on Russia. In fact, what we're seeing greater tension between the US and Russia on the ground in Northeast Syria. And this is precisely because the Russians have been able to make more inroads into this area. And so incidents on the ground between US forces, and the number is quite small, by the way. The US is now down to about 500 or 600 special operations forces on the ground from a high of 2,000. But these 500 or so find themselves now in closer proximity to Russian forces on the ground. My own sense is, and General McKenzie hinted at this yesterday, that at least from the perspective of the Trump administration, that the US presence in Syria will not be a long-term one. And so I think that regional players are very, very much aware of this. Zaki pointed out the Caesar sanctions, and yes, that's been, I think, an important and powerful tool. However, I also think there are real questions about the humanitarian impact of the sanctions and to what extent the sanctions are actually worsening the situation on the ground. When we had our event last week with the Syrian doctors, we have a Syrian doctor who spoke to us from Raqqa. That's the former capital of ISIS's so-called caliphate in the northeast. He said that they have seen a 500 to 600% increase in the price of medication and medical assistance as a result of the Caesar sanctions. Now, that's what he's saying. We would have to be able to confirm that. But I think the sanctions are not a panacea, is really what I'm saying. And I'm not sure exactly how much leverage those sanctions provide the US with respect to being able to influence an eventual political settlement.
Thanks, Mona. Maybe at this point, Zaki, we could go back to the second part of my question, but in the meantime, there was also a question that came up, which I believe is directed to you, specifically asking how could civil society be supported in Syria on the ground?
Yes, now in terms of WHO, I think they changed their attitude and they accept to support directly the civil society organizations in Northwest and to have direct contact with the authority in Northeast region. Now, in terms of the support provided to civil society in Syria, mainly in the government-controlled area, it's very difficult question because there is a kind of dilemma here: how to support Syrian people and Syrian civil society in regime-controlled area without legitimizing the regime itself, because the regime controls the state institutions. And any support should come through these, in a way or another, through these institutions. That's why there is a need to come up with, innovative ideas to support civil society. For instance, and of course, to overcome the impact of sanctions, because as Mona said, sanctions actually are not necessary meeting their objectives, at least the claimed objectives in changing the behavior of the regime. Actually, in contrary, the sanctions are empowering cronies and pro-regime warlords in Syria, because they benefit from the rent coming from the sanctions through smuggling activities, for example. So that's why sanctions are indirectly empowering more and more Syrian regime. So how to overcome the sanctions impact on civil society? That's why we need to come up with innovative ideas. For example, coming up with alternative structure or alternative financial channels to support directly the civil society initiatives inside Syria. And I believe there is a kind of example here with Iran. I mean, it's in a different context, but we can build on this experience. The Swiss financial channel for Iran to support the Iranian people with the humanitarian aid. So there is a need to come up with alternative or parallel financial structure directly open with the civil society initiatives inside Syria. There is a need to support these initiatives or to provide financial, technical support for these initiatives and try to, as I said before, to establish or to contribute or to coordinate with these initiatives to come up with different alternatives, to come up with economic alternatives even at micro levels. So yes, the process of supporting civil society in regime-controlled areas is very difficult, but there are always ways that we need to think about to provide this kind of support.
It very much indicates what you're saying, how big the challenges are. And in an effort to address one problem, you find yourself sometimes creating another one, which is very much suggested by the sanctions case there. There's a very good question that has just come up, Mona, on the issue of cross-border assistance. I'd like to read the question, but also on top of it, have inject my own. And I'd like to start first with my own. Well, what happens in the event that the UN Security Council resolution is not renewed? What will happen after all? And here is the question: what does the UN's decision on limiting border crossing say about the efficacy of international institutions to improve the situation in Syria? Does the UN still have any value in conflicts like this? I really wish this question was directed to me, because I have a lot that I would love to say on this, but Mona, you're very experienced too. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Kemal. I think that is a terrific question, and it's one that I've pondered quite a bit in my time, certainly at AID and also now at USIP, working on the Syrian conflict, which I think is emblematic of 21st century conflicts and the complexities and challenges that they pose to the international community. I think the question really points to the fact that the conflict in Syria in many ways has exposed just how insufficient the UN system is to contending with such complex conflicts. Absolutely, if we look at the UN Security Council, it has been essentially unable to really address the needs for ceasefire, unfettered flow of humanitarian assistance. We have seen the transgression of the most basic norms with respect to how civilians are treated in a conflict zone. In Syria, we've seen barrel bombs. We've seen the use of chemical weapons with such regularity that they're almost considered, or they're almost used as though they were conventional weapons. And we've seen the inability of the international community to include the UN system and UN organizations to respond effectively. We're really seeing in many ways, in my view, the obsolescence of the UN system to address these kinds of conflicts. And so this UN cross-border system that we described was some attempt to adapt to the complexity of the conflict. But again, Kemal, to your question, if in fact the resolution is not renewed, and my guess is in all likelihood it will not be renewed, it's going to pose a huge dilemma for the international community, because I think, as Zaki pointed out very well, and as I've noted, passing all of the assistance through Damascus is replete with problems. It's both the local NGOs that are tied to the regime. They are clients of the regime. But also, unfortunately, some of the UN agencies themselves. I mean, there are many, for example, in the US, who are now questioning the efficacy of channeling US humanitarian assistance through UN agencies on the ground in Damascus. one quick point on the WHO, which very much, I think, is relevant to what we're talking about. The WHO has received lots of criticism for its role in terms of being considered too close to the Assad regime. One example of this is when the UN crossing in eastern Syria with Iraq was threatened and eventually was actually, was taken out of the architecture. The WHO, rather than pushing for maintaining that crossing, which is a very important crossing with respect to medical, getting medical supplies into northeast Syria, really took the position of the Assad regime and relented on the need for maintaining that crossing. And I think that's often viewed as just one example of how the WHO, unfortunately, has not been able to maintain real independence with respect to the Syrian government. And that's because, last point, it has to operate on the ground in Damascus, and it has to figure out how to maneuver. But in so doing, has made, I think, many compromises that really undermine the work. So I think the question is a great one. I think this is something we're going to have to ponder for many, many years to come and figure out what a new UN system, a revamped system looks like that's able to more effectively address these challenges.
Many thanks, Mona. I do want to turn to you too, Zaki, from the experience you have and the contacts on the ground in Syria. How do they look at the UN and at the role of the United Nations from a humanitarian but also political perspective?
Yes, actually, there are two different ideas about the UN activities inside Syria or in the regime, mainly in regime-controlled area or in government-controlled area. The first one is the important role played by these agencies in mitigating the negative impact of conflict on local communities. And this is actually, there is a clear impact of the intervention of different UN agencies in mitigating the impact of conflict on local communities in Syria. But at the same time, the majority of Syrians believe that UN agencies, or many of these UN agencies, are involved in the corrupt network that dominates the economic situation in government-controlled area. For example, many Syrians or many Syrian experts, if I can say, they know that, for example, UNICEF were involved directly, or some senior employees in UNICEF was involved directly in corrupt transactions with the Ministry of Education in Syria and with one of the cronies, pro-regime cronies in Syria, who is Mohammed Hamshar. So Syrian people believe that some activities of UN are very useful for them and it's needed and they don't have alternatives. That's why they need the aid of these agencies. But at the same time, the majority of Syrians believe that there is a need to have an effective monitoring system to control or to monitor the activities of UN agencies to avoid corruption and to avoid this relations with cronies, and which affect negatively at the end the aid directed to Syrian people.
Thanks, Zaki. We're almost coming to the end of our event. I'd like to, we've run out of questions, so I'd like to turn around to both of you and ask you if you have any concluding remarks you'd like to make. But in the meantime, although I really honestly agree with all the observations that Zaki and also Mona have made about the UN, I would still like to come in defense of the UN on two grounds. Zaki, you kind of hinted at it, and I will put it under the term you employed, mitigating. I have worked quite a bit on refugee issues in the field in Turkey. Against all odds, I'd like to acknowledge the good work that FAO, UNDP, UNHCR are doing, and I honestly feel that the picture would be worse, even worse, if they were not around. And my second quick point is that the people who work in the UN, in some ways, have their hands tied behind their backs too, because at the end of the day, it's states, member states, who have significant control over how much leeway UN agencies are able to enjoy. However, I do agree, especially Mona, as we've entered the 21st century, the UN system that was put into place after the Second World War is under challenge. But I fear to think what the world would look like without the UN, and what the alternative could be. Now, we still have exactly 2 minutes before our time is up. I'd like to give a minute each. Mona, why don't we start with you and complete with with Zaki, and then I will thank the audience and you all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kamal. Let me just say very quickly, first, let me be very clear. I certainly don't mean to undermine or underestimate the great value of the UN, both inside Syria and in surrounding countries. I think what I was really speaking to is over the evolution of the conflict, the concerns that have been raised by some in the international community about these issues with respect to compromises that sometimes have to be made on the ground in order to get the work done. Let me in particular underscore the great value of UNHCR, which is the refugee agency, which is not working inside Syria so much as it is working in the surrounding countries. And there the work has been phenomenal. Last point, I do think that the conflict in Syria points to more broadly a need for a reform of the UN system in order to bring it into the 21st century. It was formed 70 years ago in a very different world than the one that we are living in today. Thanks.
Thank you, Mona. We're on the same page. I feel much better now. Zaki?
Yes, I totally agree with you and Mona that the UN system, the UN has a very important role in conflicts, especially in conflict in Syria. But there is a need for reform, and we can say that what would be the case if we have better. If we had better UN systems. So yeah, there is a need for reform. One last point regarding the Syrian conflict. I believe that there is a need to always highlight the root cause of the conflict in Syria, because you mentioned that Syria before 2011 was relatively good. And this was the situation in general indicators. But in fact, Syria at that time was facing and suffering from a lot of political and economic and even social exclusion. And we believe that this is the core root of the problem. Without solving these problems, the conflict will not be solved sustainably, if we can say. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Zaki, for reminding us about the root causes behind the conflict in Syria. Thank you. And Mona, thank you to you too. I think this was a great discussion. I'd like to thank the audience as well. I'm afraid in this Zoom pandemic context, we are unable to have eye contact. I belong to a generation that is really encountering challenges in adjusting to that. But I'd like to express once more my appreciation for your participation and also the questions you raised. Sumaya, am I turning the floor to you? But as I do that, I think we have a new topic for the Pacific Council to discuss maybe in a future event, is the issue of reform of the United Nations. So I thank you all. Thanks to the Pacific Council, and thanks to you all. Take care and be safe.
Thank you.